before the story of the man they called the Hammer truly begins, before we delve into the labyrinth of his violent rise and his explosive end, a word must be spoken in the clear, sober light of the present. The tale you are about to hear, woven from the dark threads of Cleveland's history, is not a fabrication. It is a meticulous reconstruction, a tapestry pieced together from the cold, hard facts of police reports, the dramatic testimonies of court transcripts, the fading ink of newspaper archives, and the whispered confessions of those who lived in his shadow. This narrative is presented to you with a singular, unwavering purpose to transport you back in time and place you as a silent witness to a chapter of American crime, to ensure that the correct information, unvarnished and complete, reaches you. It is a story of ambition, power, and the inevitable price they demand, told not to glorify the darkness, but to understand its shape and its consequences. So prepare yourself. Settle in. We are stepping out of the light and into the Cleveland of another era, a city of roaring industry and deep, dark secrets, where a young boy named Alex Burns was about to learn his first, most brutal lessons on how to survive. The genesis of a criminal empire is often found not in a single, dramatic decision, but in the slow, grinding crucible of poverty and neglect. For Alex, Shondor Birns, that crucible was the Woodland Avenue neighborhood of early 20th century Cleveland, a bustling, noisy, and fiercely competitive world of immigrant dreams deferred. He was born into a Hungarian Jewish family in 1907, a time when the city was a magnet for those seeking work in its roaring steel mills and factories. But the American promise was a fragile one, and it shattered early for Shondor. His father, a figure who remains little more than a ghost in the historical record, abandoned the family, leaving them to navigate the harsh realities of tenement life without a patriarch. This abandonment planted a seed of profound self-reliance in the boy, a belief that the world was a hostile place, and that trust was a luxury he could not afford. His mother, struggling to keep food on the table, had little time or energy to impose discipline, and the streets swiftly became his true classroom and his proving ground. The Woodland Avenue neighborhood was a mosaic of ethnic enclaves, Italians, Jews, Irish, blacks, all jostling for space and a sliver of prosperity. In this environment, physical strength and a willingness to project fear were the most valuable currencies. Shondor was small for his age, but he compensated for this with a terrifying, unrestrained ferocity. He did not merely get into fights. He engaged in savage, conclusive battles designed to leave a permanent impression on his victims and any onlookers. His goal was not to win an argument, but to annihilate the opposition's will to ever challenge him again. It was from this relentless aggression that his nickname, Shondor, a Hungarian derivative of Alexander, emerged. On the lips of his peers, it was not a term of endearment, but a label for a force of nature, a warning to be heeded. His formal education was brief and inconsequential, a series of interruptions and eventual dropouts. The structured hierarchy of a school, with its teachers and rules, was an anathema to him. He was already building his own hierarchy, one where he sat at the top, and his authority was derived from his fists and his fearlessness. His first significant brush with the law came at 17, an age when most boys were thinking about their futures. Shondor's future arrived with the clang of a cell door. Arrested for robbery, a charge that signaled his move from petty delinquency to serious crime, he was sent to the Boys' Industrial School in Lancaster, Ohio. This reform school, far from reforming him, served as a finishing school for his criminal ambitions. It was here that he networked with a generation of young Ohio hoodlums, forging connections that would later form the backbone of his statewide rackets. He learned the nuances of criminal enterprise, the importance of alliances, and the delicate art of knowing whom to trust and whom to betray. When he was released back onto the streets of Cleveland, he was no longer just a street thug. He was a budding entrepreneur of the underworld, and the timing was perfect. The roaring 20s were in full swing, and prohibition had created a vast, illegal economy. Shondor Birns found his first major opportunity in bootlegging. He joined the ranks of runners, learning the intricate logistics of moving alcohol from production sites to secret warehouses to speakeasies. This was a business that required not just brute force, but intelligence. It required bribing police officers and federal agents, negotiating with rival gangs to avoid turf wars, and maintaining a network of drivers and distributors who could be trusted under pressure. It was during this period that he honed the skills that would define his career: strategic corruption, the use of violence as a precise business tool, and the ability to manage complex, illegal operations with corporate efficiency. The end of Prohibition in 1933 was a setback for many, but for a pragmatist like Birns, it was simply a market correction. He saw the void left by legalized alcohol and moved swiftly to fill it with a new, even more profitable vice: the numbers racket. This was the beginning of his true ascent. The moment the street brawler began his transformation into the Cleveland mobster. The demise of Prohibition was not an end, but a pivot, a forced evolution that separated the common thugs from the criminal visionaries. Shondor Birns, with his keen understanding of supply, demand, and human weakness, looked upon the struggling, hopeful masses in Cleveland's neighborhoods and saw a gold mine far richer than any bootleg operation. He turned his attention to the numbers racket, an illicit lottery known by many names: Policy, the Italian lottery, the daily number, a simple game of chance that offered a tantalizing dream of escape from poverty for the price of a few pennies. The mechanics were elegantly cruel. A bettor would choose a 3-digit number, often based on dreams, birth dates, or other personal superstitions. This number was written on a slip of paper, and the bet, usually a nickel or a dime, was handed to a runner, the foot soldier of the operation. The winning number was typically derived from a publicly verifiable source, such as the daily U.S. Treasury balance or the results of a horse race to assure players of its legitimacy. The odds of winning were astronomically low, something like 1 in 1,000, but the payoff, often 600 to 1, was a siren song for the desperate. The true genius of the system and the source of Birns's immense wealth was the cut. The house kept a large percentage of the daily intake, ensuring a massive, steady profit that flowed upwards like an underground river. Before Burns, the numbers game in Cleveland was a disorganized, neighborhood-based affair run by small-time operators who often warred with each other, creating instability and drawing unwanted police attention. Shondor Birns saw the inefficiency and moved to correct it with the mind of a corporate raider. He began a campaign of consolidation, a hostile takeover of the Cleveland underworld. He provided the capital, the organization, and most importantly, the enforcement. Runners and bankers who refused to align with him would find their operations disrupted, their slips confiscated, their persons threatened. Store owners who hosted numbers slips were offered a simple choice: a percentage of the take for their cooperation, or a broken window, a firebomb, or a severe beating for their refusal. Burns's enforcers, men who shared his appetite for violence, became the system's quality control. He brought corporate structure to chaos, creating a sleek, efficient syndicate that minimized internal conflict and maximized profit. His primary territory became the predominantly black neighborhoods of the central Scoville area, a community largely ignored by the city's power structure and thus ripe for exploitation. He understood that in these communities, where legitimate economic opportunities were scarce, the numbers game was not just a pastime. It was a deeply embedded part of the social and economic fabric. He became their unofficial and unwilling banker. He was known to extend credit to regular players, and there are even accounts of him providing financial assistance for funerals or medical emergencies for loyal bettors or their families. This was not altruism, it was brilliant, cynical public relations. It fostered a perverse sense of loyalty, a feeling that Shondor was a man you could turn to when the system had failed you. This carefully cultivated image, part benevolent boss, part unassailable warlord, allowed his empire to grow at an astonishing rate. At its peak, his numbers operation was pulling in millions of dollars annually, all of it untaxed and pure profit. This river of cash needed to be cleaned, and so Burns invested heavily in legitimate fronts. He owned and operated bars, nightclubs like the famous Theatrical Grill, a haunt for politicians, policemen, celebrities, and gangsters, laundromats, and real estate. These establishments served a dual purpose. They laundered his illicit gains and provided a stage for his public persona. He was no longer the scrawny kid from Woodland Avenue. He was a man of substance, a power broker. He was always impeccably dressed in tailored suits, drove the most expensive Cadillacs, and was a lavish spender, known for throwing around $100 tips when a few dollars would have been generous. This flamboyance was a weapon, a declaration of his power and his immunity. He was sending a message to the city, to the police, and to his rivals. Shondor Birns was untouchable. He moved in a world where the lines between the criminal and the legitimate were deliberately blurred. He cultivated relationships with figures in City Hall and within the Cleveland Police Department. Cash filled envelopes changed hands in back rooms of his clubs, ensuring that his operations would be overlooked. that arrests would be rare, and that when they did happen, the consequences would be minimal. He understood that the true key to power in a modern city was not just controlling the underworld, but corrupting the overworld. He built a fortress around himself made of money, fear, and political protection. But in the shadows he cast, new threats were emerging, younger, hungrier men who looked upon his empire not with respect, but with envy. And the very violence he had used to build his kingdom would, in time, be turned against him in the most brutal and final way imaginable. The fortress of power that Shondor Birns constructed was not built with bricks and mortar, but with a currency far more potent, fear. His nickname, the Hammer, was not merely a label. It was an operational doctrine. While the public saw the flamboyant nightclub owner, the underworld felt the relentless, crushing weight of his enforcement. His reign was punctuated by acts of such savage brutality that they became legend. Cautionary tales whispered in barrooms and back alleys to ensure compliance without the need for constant demonstration. One of the most chilling, and perhaps apocryphal, stories that cemented his reputation involved a dispute with a rival over territory. The man, foolishly believing himself to be on equal footing, had threatened to disrupt Birns's operation. Shondor did not respond with a warning or a negotiation. He invited the man to a meeting at one of his establishments. When the rival arrived, confident and smug, Birns was waiting, not with henchmen, but with a simple, terrifying tool on the table before him, a claw hammer. Without a word of greeting or threat, Birns stood, picked up the hammer, and with a cold, methodical fury, brought it down upon the man's hand, shattering the bones on the tabletop. The message was delivered not with a speech, but with the sound of splintering bone and a scream of agony. The story spread like wildfire through the criminal fraternity. It was efficient, graphic, and unforgettable. This was the essence of Shondor Birns's management style. He understood that in his world, reputation was everything, and a reputation for unpredictable. Extreme violence was a more effective shield than any number of armed bodyguards. It created a perimeter of dread around him, allowing him to move through the city with an aura of invincibility. This aura was further enhanced by his intricate web of corruption, which extended deep into the heart of Cleveland's official institutions. The Theatrical Grill, his flagship nightclub on Short Vincent Avenue, was the nerve center of this corrupt network. It was a place where the city's dualities converged. In the smoky, dimly lit room, judges clinked glasses with bookmakers, city councilmen shared laughs with loan sharks, and high-ranking police officials took their regular payoffs from Birns himself in the back office. The club was a symbol of his power, a physical manifestation of his ability to erase the line between law and lawlessness. He was not hiding from the authorities. He was entertaining them, bribing them, and making them complicit in his empire. This corruption provided him with an early warning system against police raids and a guarantee of leniency should he ever find himself in a courtroom. It was a perfectly calibrated system of mutual benefit. The officials received a steady, untaxed income, and Birns received the freedom to operate his multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise in plain sight. Yet, for all his power and insulation, Birns was a man of his time, and the tectonic plates of organized crime in America were shifting. The post-war era saw the rise of more corporate, nationally connected syndicates, and Cleveland was a prized jewel. While Birns was the undisputed king of the numbers racket, other powerful and ultimately more dangerous criminal organizations were eyeing his domain. The most significant of these was the Cleveland crime family, often referred to as the Mayfield Road Mob, led by powerful figures like Frank Milano and later John Scalish. This was a traditionally Italian syndicate with strong ties to the New York families, and they viewed Birns, a Jewish independent operator, as an anomaly, a powerful but ultimately isolated figure who controlled a revenue stream they coveted. For years, an uneasy truce existed. Birns was too powerful, too entrenched, and too violently unpredictable to move against directly. He paid tribute when necessary, maintained a cautious, transactional relationship with the family, and focused on solidifying his own power base. But this delicate balance was destined to collapse. The first major crack in his armor appeared not from a rival gangster's bullet, but from the federal government. In 1955, the U.S. Treasury Department, armed with new tools and a determination to tackle organized crime's financial underpinnings, set its sights on Shondor Birns. They built a case not for murder or extortion, which were difficult to prove, but for tax evasion, the same weapon that had felled Al Capone. The trial was a spectacle, pulling back the curtain on Birns's opulent lifestyle. The prosecution presented evidence of his vast expenditures: the cars, the suits, the properties, the lavish tips, all of which stood in stark contrast to his meager reported income. He was convicted and sentenced to a federal prison. For the first time in decades, the Hammer was behind bars, not in a local cell where his influence could reach, but in a federal penitentiary. His empire was suddenly leaderless, a kingdom without its king, and in the shadows, younger, hungrier wolves began to circle, waiting for their moment to tear it all apart. The clang of the federal prison gate closing behind Shondor Birns in the mid-1950s echoed far beyond his cell block. It was a seismic event in the Cleveland underworld, a signal that the old order might be vulnerable. His incarceration, while a significant personal and professional setback, was not the end. Birns was a resilient predator, and even from behind bars, his influence pulsed through the city. He had built his empire with a structure robust enough to withstand his temporary absence, managed by a small, trusted cadre of lieutenants who understood the consequences of failure or betrayal. Yet, the very nature of power is that it abhors a vacuum, and his imprisonment created a subtle but perceptible one. It was during this period that the landscape of crime in Cleveland began to evolve in ways that would ultimately prove fatal to him. A new generation was rising, men who lacked the old world codes of conduct that, however brutal, had imposed a certain rough order. This new breed was more entrepreneurial, more reckless, and saw violence not just as a tool for enforcement, but as a primary business strategy. The most dangerous of these new players was a man named Danny Greene. Greene was everything Birns was not. A flamboyant, red-haired Irishman from Cleveland's Collinwood neighborhood. A charismatic and media-savvy figure who cultivated a public image as a modern-day Celtic warrior. A rebel against the established Italian and Jewish mobs. He began his criminal career as a longshoreman union official, using strong armed tactics to rise through the ranks, and quickly branched out into loan sharking, extortion, and eventually the very numbers racket that was Burns's lifeblood. Greene was bold, ambitious, and utterly fearless. He understood the power of spectacle, driving a green car, wearing green clothes, and famously leaving a shamrock at the scenes of his crimes. He was a master of psychological warfare, and he viewed the aging, incarcerated Burns not as a revered elder to be respected, but as a relic to be supplanted. When Burns was released from prison after serving his sentence, he returned to a city that had subtly changed. He was older, the world was younger, and the deference he had once commanded was now tinged with challenge. He reclaimed control of his numbers empire, but he could feel the tectonic plates shifting beneath his feet. The Cleveland crime family, under the quiet but firm leadership of John Scalish, was also watching Greene's rise with growing alarm. Scalish preferred the old ways, a quiet, profitable coexistence, but Greene was a tornado disrupting everything. A complex and deadly triangle of conflict began to form the established, traditional mafia under Scalish, the old-school, independent kingpin Burns, and the volatile, unpredictable newcomer, Danny Greene. Initially, there was a fleeting, pragmatic alliance between Burns and the mafia against their common, disruptive enemy. It was an alliance of convenience, a marriage of pure calculation with no trust or affection. They shared intelligence, resources, and even, it is believed, coordinated some of the early, failed attempts on Greene's life. Greene, with an almost supernatural knack for survival, seemed to lead a charmed life. Cars bombed with him in them would fail to detonate properly. Assassins would inexplicably miss their mark. Each failure emboldened him and frustrated his older, more methodical adversaries. For Burns, this new war was a distasteful necessity. He was a man who had always dealt with problems directly and conclusively. The protracted, shadowy conflict with Greene was a drain on his resources and a constant insult to his authority. The rules of the game had changed, and Burns, for all his cunning, was struggling to adapt. The violence was becoming more public, more brazen, moving from back alley beatings to car bombs in busy parking lots, drawing a level of police and media scrutiny that was bad for business for everyone. The pressure was immense, and it was within this pressure cooker that the final fatal conspiracy against Danny Greene began to take shape. But in the treacherous world of the Cleveland underworld, alliances were as stable as smoke, and the hunter could become the prey in an instant. Burns, believing he was orchestrating the elimination of a rival, was unaware that the threads of his own fate were being pulled taut, that a plot was weaving itself around him, one that would not end with a rival's death, but with his own spectacular and terrifying demise. The final act of Shondor Birns's life was a descent into a maelstrom of paranoia, betrayal, and a fundamental miscalculation that would cost him everything. Upon his return from prison, the city he had once ruled with an iron fist felt different. The air charged with a new kind of danger he couldn't control through simple, brutal force. The alliance with the Cleveland Mafia against Danny Greene was always a fragile pact, a spider's web of shared interest that could be torn apart by the slightest breeze of suspicion. And suspicion was the currency of the realm. The failed attempts on Greene's life had not only made the Irishman more cautious, but had also made him more aggressive, more daring in his provocations. He was a master of taunting his enemies, understanding that, in a war of nerves, his youthful audacity was a weapon against their older, more cautious temperaments. For Birns, every day that Greene remained alive was a personal insult, a public erosion of his power. The situation reached a boiling point, and it became clear that a more definitive, more sophisticated solution was required. It was in this superheated atmosphere that the plot that would kill both Greene and Birns began to crystallize. The key figures in this conspiracy were a treacherous blend of old and new. From the Mafia side, the planning was believed to be led by associates of James Liccavalli, a powerful underboss, and included up and coming mobsters like Ray Ferrito, a skilled and reliable hitman. On the periphery, and crucially involved in the logistics, was a man named Keith Ritson, a protege and close associate of Birns himself. The plan was audacious and reflected the new era of violence. Car bombs. They were impersonal, devastatingly effective, and sent a message of sheer terror. The target was, of course, Danny Greene. The conspiracy needed a safe house, funding, and coordination. It is here that the historical record becomes murky with duplicity. Shondor Birns, desperate to be rid of his nemesis, is widely believed to have provided significant financial backing for the operation. He saw it as an investment in restoring order, in establishing the dominance of the old guard. He trusted his associate, Keith Ritson, to handle the details, to be his link to the Mafia triggermen. But trust was the poison in the cup, unbeknownst to Birns. The very alliance he was funding was already rotten with betrayal. Some theories suggest that the Mafia, particularly Liccavalli and his crew, had come to see Birns himself as a problem. He was an independent, a loose cannon who knew too much about their operations. He was a link that, if broken, would be difficult for the authorities to follow. The idea began to form: why not eliminate both problems at once? Use Birns's own money to fund the hit on Greene, and then eliminate Birns himself, thereby wiping the slate clean and allowing the Mafia to absorb his lucrative numbers racket without a messy war. Another, equally plausible theory points the finger of betrayal directly at his inner circle. Keith Ritson, the trusted lieutenant, may have been playing a double game, feeding information to both sides, perhaps even skimming from the funds Birns provided, and ultimately seeing a greater future for himself in a post-Birns world under the Mafia's banner. The exact motivations may be lost to history, but the outcome is not. A plot within a plot was hatched. while Ray Ferrito and his team began stalking Danny Greene, meticulously learning his routines, his haunts, the make and model of his car. Another parallel plan was taking shape. Shondor Birns, believing he was safely orchestrating events from the shadows, was in fact being led into a trap. He went about his business, a routine that was as regular as clockwork, making him a predictable and easy target. He would hold court at the Theatrical Grill, meet with his associates, and visit his girlfriend. He felt secure in his fortress of fear and corruption, unaware that the walls had already been compromised from within. The hammer that had fallen on so many others was now poised, held by an unseen hand, ready to strike its creator. The final days of March 1975 were ticking down, and the city of Cleveland, oblivious to the storm gathering in its underworld, was about to be rocked by two explosions that would tear the veil off its long, simmering gang war and mark the brutal end of an era. The final day of Shondor Birns' life, March 29, 1975, dawned like any other, a crisp late winter day in Cleveland, offering no portent of the horror to come. For a man who had lived by the sword for nearly 7 decades, his routine was remarkably mundane, a testament to the comfort and confidence that his power afforded him. He was a creature of habit, and that habit would be his undoing. His last day was a series of ordinary acts, each one observed and noted by the unseen eyes that had been tracking him, learning the rhythm of his life to better orchestrate its end. He began his day at his apartment, then made his way to his central command post, the Theatrical Grill. The club in the daylight was a different entity, stripped of its nocturnal glamour, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and disinfectant. Here, he conducted business, meeting with numbers runners who delivered the previous day's take, discussing with his bar manager the supplies needed for the weekend, and taking phone calls in the back office. There was a meeting, fatefully, with Keith Ritson, the man who was perhaps already orchestrating his death. The conversation they had is lost to time, but it would have been laced with the normalcy of trusted association, a discussion of finances, of the ongoing Greene situation, a perfect mask for treachery. Birns, the master of deception, was himself being utterly deceived. In the afternoon, he left the grill, his movements as predictable as the hands of a clock. He was driving his prized possession, a gleaming 1974 Lincoln Continental Marka V, a symbol of his success, a tank of steel and luxury that he believed made him impervious. His destination was the apartment of his girlfriend, Joanita, in the Euclid Avenue area. This was a regular visit, part of the weekly pattern he had followed for years. He parked the large car on the street, a dark green beast that stood out amidst the more modest vehicles, and went inside, completely unaware that his Lincoln had already been identified as the perfect instrument of his execution. While he was inside, the assassin struck with chilling precision and speed. The bomb that was planted under the driver's side of his car was a professional's weapon, not a crude, makeshift device. It was a command wire bomb, a type that required the killer to be nearby, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to complete the circuit and unleash hell. This method was chosen for its certainty. It eliminated the risk of a timer malfunction or a premature detonation. It was a tool of cold, calculated intent. The bomb itself was potent, constructed with several sticks of dynamite, carefully wired to concentrate its force upwards through the floorboard of the car, designed not just to destroy the vehicle, but to annihilate its occupant. The killer, or killers, would have been positioned somewhere with a clear line of sight, perhaps in a parked car further down the street, or in a nearby building, holding the detonator, their finger on the switch, their heart likely pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. They waited as the late afternoon light began to fade, the city winding down for the evening. Inside the apartment, Birns and his girlfriend shared what would be their final moments together, a mundane domestic scene that stood in stark contrast to the technological death waiting for him just outside the window. He eventually prepared to leave, gathering his coat, perhaps sharing a final kiss, completely unaware that he was stepping out of one world and into the fiery abyss of the next. He walked out of the building, a man in his late 60s, still carrying himself with the authority of a king, and approached the driver's side door of his Lincoln Continental. He inserted the key, unlocked the door, and opened it. As he began to lower himself into the plush leather driver's seat, his weight settling into the car, the hidden watcher saw their moment. This was the trigger. The act of entering the car was the signal. In that infinitesimal moment between sitting down and closing the door, the killer closed the circuit. The explosion that tore through the quiet Euclid Avenue street on the evening of March 29, 1975 was not merely a sound, it was a physical force. A thunderclap of obliteration that shattered windows for a block in every direction and sent a shockwave through the very foundations of the city's underworld. The meticulously placed dynamite under the driver's side of Shondor Birns' Lincoln Continental detonated with a concussive roar, transforming the symbol of his opulent success into a twisted, burning coffin of white, hot shrapnel. The force of the blast was so immense that it ripped the massive automobile completely in half, hurling the engine block a staggering 50 feet away from the smoldering wreckage. The rear axle was torn off and launched through the front window of a nearby apartment like a deadly projectile. The car's doors were sheared from their hinges and sent spinning into the air, while the luxurious interior was instantly consumed by a raging fireball that turned the twilight into a grotesque, flickering noon. For those residents who came running to their windows or spilled out onto the street in panic and confusion, the scene was one of surreal horror. Where a majestic car had been moments before, there was now a cratered, burning shell, and the air was thick with the acrid stench of cordite, burning gasoline, and something far worse. The body of Shondor Birns, the Hammer, who had ruled Cleveland's shadows for decades, was subjected to a violence so total it was almost abstract. He was, for all intents and purposes, vaporized by the initial blast. First responders arriving on the scene found a scene of such gruesome devastation that it was initially impossible to identify any human remains amidst the scorched metal and shattered glass. It would take a meticulous and grim search by the Cleveland Police Department's Homicide Unit and the coroner to locate and collect the fragments of what was once a man. The official reports would later state, in cold, clinical language, that the victim had sustained massive traumatic injuries and was dismembered. The reality was far more primitive. The man who had built an empire on fear was reduced to a collection of charred tissue and bone, requiring dental records to provide a positive identification. The news of the bombing spread through the city with the speed of the explosion itself. It was the lead story on every television newscast, the banner headline in the next day's Plain Dealer. For the general public, it was a shocking, terrifying spectacle, a brazen act of violence that felt like something from a gangster movie, not their city streets. But for those in the know, for the police, the politicians, and the rival gangsters, the message was crystal clear and chillingly simple. No one was safe. The old rules were dead. The bomb that killed Burns was a declaration of a new, more ruthless war. The Cleveland Police Department launched its largest homicide investigation in years, but they were met with the same wall of silence that had protected Burns during his life. Witnesses were scarce, and those who had seen anything were suddenly struck with amnesia. The fear that Burns had cultivated now protected his killers. The investigation quickly zeroed in on the ongoing gang war, and the name Danny Greene was on everyone's lips. It seemed the most logical conclusion. Burns had been trying to kill Greene, and Greene had struck first with breathtaking finality. The city held its breath, waiting for the inevitable retaliation, for the other shoe to drop. The underworld was a powder keg, and Burns's murder had lit the fuse. But in the intricate web of betrayal that had led to that moment on Euclid Avenue, the truth was far more complex and duplicitous. The bomb that killed Shondor Birns was not the end of the story. It was merely the catalyst for a chain of events that would unravel the entire conspiracy, exposing the betrayals and ultimately leading to a justice of a sort that would be delivered not in a courtroom, but with more fire and steel on the streets of Cleveland. In the immediate, shock-filled aftermath of Shondor Birns' assassination, a thick, paralyzing fog of fear descended upon Cleveland's criminal underworld. The spectacular and ruthless nature of the killing sent an unambiguous message to every mobster, bookmaker, and enforcer in the city. The era of predictable, if brutal, territorial disputes was over, replaced by a new age of annihilative violence where car bombs were the preferred instrument of negotiation. The primary suspect, in the eyes of both the police and the public, was Danny Greene. The logic was inescapable. Greene and Burns were sworn enemies, locked in a bloody feud, and Greene, with his flair for the dramatic and his proven resilience, had both the motive and the temperament for such a brazen act. The Cleveland Mafia, under John Scalish, saw an opportunity in this public perception. They could allow the blame to fall squarely on the volatile Irishman, letting him take the heat from the police while they positioned themselves to quietly absorb the pieces of Burns's fractured empire. For a few tense months, this narrative held. The investigation into Birns's murder, despite its high profile, stalled against the traditional wall of Omert. But the conspiracy that killed Birns was a complex machine with too many moving parts, and it was only a matter of time before a gear slipped. The unraveling began not with a confession, but with another bomb, one that failed to achieve its objective. On May 16, 1975, just weeks after Birns was killed, a bomb was placed under the car of a man named Leo Lips Mosseri, a high-ranking member of the Cleveland Mafia. The bomb detonated, but Mosseri, by some miracle, survived. The attempt on his life signaled a brutal internal power struggle within the Mafia itself, a purge of those who may have known too much about the Birns operation or who were deemed untrustworthy. This failed assassination created ripples of paranoia that spread through the organization. Then, on October 6, 1975, the other shoe finally dropped, and it did so with the same explosive force that had killed Birns. Danny Greene was leaving a dentist's appointment at a building in Lyndhurst, a suburb of Cleveland. As he walked toward his car, a green Oldsmobile parked in the lot. A massive bomb hidden in a van parked nearby was detonated by remote control. The force of the explosion was catastrophic, lifting Greene's car into the air and tearing his body apart. The Celtic warrior was dead. His charmed life finally ended. The brazen public murder of another major figure, this time in a suburb in broad daylight, created a firestorm of public and political pressure. The FBI, which had been monitoring the gang war, now entered the investigation in full force, combining resources with the Cleveland police in a dedicated task force. They knew these two bombings were connected. It was a tug of war that had ended with both participants being torn in half. The break the investigators desperately needed came from an unexpected source, the conscience, or more likely, the self-preservation instinct of a minor player. A small-time criminal named Ronnie Carabia, who had been involved in the logistics of the Greene bombing, was arrested on an unrelated charge. Facing serious prison time and fearing he would be the next target in the ongoing purge, he decided to talk. He provided the FBI with a crucial name, Ray Ferrito. Ferrito, a seasoned hitman from Erie, Pennsylvania, with ties to the Pittsburgh crime family, had been brought in by the Cleveland Mafia as a reliable outside contractor for the dirty work. With Carabia's testimony, the FBI now had a thread to pull. They located Ferrito and applied immense pressure. Confronted with the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, Ferrito made a calculated decision. He would become the government's star witness. His cooperation would be the key that unlocked the entire sordid conspiracy. He began to talk, and the story he told was one of breathtaking betrayal, revealing that the plot was far more intricate and duplicitous than anyone had imagined. It was a story that implicated not just the killers in the field, but the men who had given the orders from the shadows, the very men Shondor Birns had believed were his allies. The floodgates of justice, or at least of retribution, were thrown open by the testimony of Ray Ferrito, a man who had been in the very eye of the hurricane, His decision to break the code of silence and cooperate with the FBI was a seismic event, transforming the investigation from a collection of theories and dead ends into a streamlined, fact-based pursuit of the conspirators. Ferrito provided a step-by-step, chillingly detailed account of the plot to kill Danny Greene, and in doing so, he illuminated the shadowy path that led directly back to the murder of Shondor Birns. He described how he was recruited by James Liccavalli, the powerful underboss of the Cleveland crime family, and other high-ranking mobsters. He was the outside specialist, the man without local ties who could do the job and then disappear. Ferrito narrated the weeks of patient, meticulous surveillance on Greene, learning his routines, his favorite places, the car he drove. He described the acquisition of the dynamite, the rental of the van that would become the bomb itself, and the final, tense moments in the Lyndhurst parking lot, where he acted as a lookout while his accomplice, now identified as another mobster named John Calandra, pressed the detonator that sent Danny Greene to his death. But the most devastating part of Ferrito's testimony, the revelation that tied the entire bloody saga together, was his account of the motivation and the broader conspiracy. He confirmed what many had suspected, but could not prove. The Cleveland Mafia, specifically James Liccavalli and his faction, had decided that both Greene and Birns had to be eliminated. Greene was a disruptive, uncontrollable force, but Birns was a liability. He was an independent who knew too many secrets, who had financial dealings with the family, and whose elimination would allow them to seize his lucrative numbers operation without a fight. Ferrito's testimony painted a picture of a cold, corporate decision made in the back rooms of social clubs and restaurants. The order was given, and the machinery of murder was set in motion. While Ferrito was focused on the Greene hit, he was aware that a separate team was handling the Birns problem. The funding for both operations, he revealed, came in part from the Mafia's coffers, but also, in a twist of cruel irony, from Shondor Birns himself. Birns, in his desperation to kill Greene, had funneled money to his trusted lieutenant, Keith Ritson, who was acting as the liaison with the mob. Unbeknownst to Birns, Ritson was either complicit in the broader plot, or was himself being manipulated, and his funds were being used to finance his own assassination. This was the ultimate betrayal, a financial and tactical deceit of Shakespearean proportions. The man was paying for the bullet that would kill him, with Ferrito's testimony providing. The conviction secured in the wake of Ray Ferrito's testimony, while delivering a form of legal justice, did not instantly erase the legacy of Shondor Birns or the violent ecosystem he had both exploited and embodied. His death and the subsequent trial marked not an end, but a violent punctuation in the long, grim story of organized crime in Cleveland, a city that seemed to have a particular talent for breeding a uniquely brutal breed of criminal. The void left by the decapitation of Burns's independent empire and the severe weakening of the traditional mafia was not a vacuum of morality, but a new commercial opportunity. Almost immediately, other forces moved in to carve up his territory. Remnants of his own organization, now leaderless, were absorbed by rival outfits or simply disintegrated into smaller, more chaotic factions. The numbers racket, the lifeblood of his wealth, began a slow evolution. The old, neighborhood-based system that Birns had perfected started to feel antiquated, and new forms of illegal gambling, along with the rising tide of the drug trade, particularly heroin and, later, cocaine, began to claim the attention and money of the criminal underworld. The corporate-like structure Birns had imposed gave way to a more fragmented, and in many ways more dangerous, landscape of competing crews. The influence of the Cleveland Mafia, so severely damaged by the convictions of Licavoli and his crew, never truly recovered its former dominance. They were pushed to the sidelines, their power steadily eroded by new ethnic gangs, more sophisticated drug trafficking networks, and relentless federal pressure. The bombings of 1975 served as a gruesome historical marker, the moment the city's old, world-organized crime structure effectively committed suicide in a spasm of internal treachery and short-sighted violence. For the city of Cleveland itself, the murders of Birns and Greene and the sensational trial that followed were a profound embarrassment. A national news story that painted the city as a lawless, corrupt backwater, a reputation it would spend decades trying to live down. It spurred political promises of reform and led to increased scrutiny of the relationships between city officials, the police department, and the underworld. The Theatrical Grill, that symbol of confluence where the powerful from both sides of the law had mingled, lost its luster and its protection, eventually closing its doors, a physical metaphor for the end of an era. For the individuals who had known Birns, his death was met with a complex mixture of emotions. For his rivals and victims, it was a moment of grim satisfaction, the final proof that no one, no matter how powerful, was beyond reach. For the many who had feared him, it was a relief, a lifting of a heavy, oppressive weight. For his family, and the very few who might have held genuine affection for him, it was a private tragedy, the violent end of a complicated man whose life had been a long, lonely walk on the razor's edge. But the public memory of Shondor Birns began to undergo a subtle transformation in the years following his death. The man, the ruthless hammer, began to fade, and the legend started to grow. He became a folk anti-hero, a symbol of a grittier, more deterministic Cleveland, a city of industry and hard knocks. Stories of his brutality were often tempered with anecdotes about his quirky generosity. The massive tips, the loans he never expected to be repaid, his unwavering, if twisted, loyalty to his own code. He was romanticized as a figure from a bygone age, a criminal who, unlike the faceless drug dealers of the new era, had a certain style, a presence. He became a subject of books, documentaries, and local folklore, a name that still evokes a powerful image of a time when the city's underworld was ruled by larger than life characters whose wars were fought with hammers and car bombs, not just anonymous drive-by shootings. The complexity of his character, the impoverished immigrant child, the savage enforcer, the shrewd businessman, the corrupter of institutions, the victim of ultimate betrayal, ensured that his story would endure, a dark and captivating chapter in the American criminal canon. To truly understand the man known as the Hammer, one must venture beyond the headlines of bombings and the cold facts of his criminal ledger and delve into the intricate and contradictory psychology that propelled him. Shondor Birns was not a simple monster. He was a complex product of a brutal environment, a man who internalized the harsh lessons of his youth and built a personal philosophy around them, a code that was as rigid as it was immoral. At the core of his being was a profound and unshakable belief in the power of fear. He had learned on the streets of Woodland Avenue that love was fleeting, respect was conditional, but fear was a tangible, durable asset. It was a currency that could be banked, a weapon that could be deployed without ever being fired. His reputation for sudden, extreme violence was not a loss of control. It was a meticulously maintained tool of statecraft. The story of the claw hammer was not an anecdote of madness, but a calculated piece of political theater, a performance designed to be recounted and amplified, saving him the trouble of repeating the act for every new challenger. This strategic use of terror allowed him to project a power far beyond his physical stature and to control a vast empire with a surprisingly small inner circle. He understood that absolute power did not come from being loved or even respected, but from being so feared that the very idea of defiance became unthinkable. Yet, intertwined with this savage pragmatism was a deep-seated need for legitimacy and status, a yearning to transcend his origins. His flamboyant lifestyle, the custom suits, the fleet of Cadillacs, the ownership of prestigious nightclubs, was not merely the enjoyment of ill-gotten gains. It was a statement. It was his way of forcing a city that had once looked down on him as a poor, fatherless immigrant boy to now acknowledge him as a man of substance and importance. The Theatrical Grill was his throne room, but it was also his sanctuary, a place where he could rub shoulders with judges and politicians, where he could feel, if not accepted, then at least indispensable. This duality extended to his personal relationships. He could be remarkably generous, known to hand out $100 bills to waitresses and bartenders. And there are accounts of him providing financial assistance to families in his old neighborhood. This was not compassion in any pure sense. It was another form of power projection, a way to build a network of obligation and loyalty that existed outside the framework of fear. He was creating his own social contract, one where he was the benefactor and the ultimate arbiter. His loyalty to those within his inner circle was fierce and unwavering, but it was a loyalty that expected absolute fealty in return. The betrayal by Keith Ritson would have been, in Burns's worldview, the most unforgivable sin imaginable, a violation not just of a business arrangement, but of the fundamental code by which he ordered his universe. This complex psychology also explains his critical miscalculation in his final days. Having survived decades of street wars, prison, and federal investigations, he had developed a sense of invulnerability. He believed his fortress of fear and corruption was impregnable. He failed to adapt to the new reality represented by Danny Greene, and the changing dynamics within the mafia. Greene was not playing by the old rules. He was a media-savvy anarchist who understood the power of celebrity and chaos. The mafia, under pressure, was becoming more corporate and more ruthless in its internal politics. Birns, the master of a certain kind of order, found himself unable to comprehend or control the new disorder. His decision to ally with the mafia against Greene was a tactical move from an old playbook, a belief that he could manipulate a larger, more traditional power to eliminate a nuisance. He did not realize that, in the eyes of that larger power, he himself had become the nuisance. His greatest weakness was his inability to see that the world had changed, and that the very traits that had made him a king, his independence, his notoriety, his vast wealth, had now made him a target. The bomb that killed him was the ultimate expression of a new, impersonal kind of violence, a far cry from the personal, hands-on brutality of the hammer. In the end, the man who had built his life on controlling fear was destroyed by a conspiracy he could not see, a betrayal he could not anticipate, and a force he could not intimidate. The world that Shondor Birns entered as a young man, the Cleveland of the 1920s and 1930s, was a city perfectly engineered for the rise of a man like him. It was a booming, brawny metropolis, a powerhouse of American industry, where steel mills, factories, and the Great Lakes shipping trade created immense wealth, but also vast, gritty neighborhoods teeming with a diverse and often desperate working class. This economic disparity was the fertile ground in which organized crime took root. Prohibition, the so-called noble experiment, was the catalyst that transformed street-level thuggery into sophisticated criminal enterprise. The demand for alcohol was insatiable, and the supply chain, from smuggling operations across Lake Erie from Canada to the distribution networks of rum runners and the speakeasies that dotted the city, required organization, capital, and a willingness to bribe and violently intimidate. Birns cut his teeth in this environment, learning the logistics of a large-scale illegal business and, most importantly, the art of corruption. He saw firsthand how police officers, prosecutors, and politicians could be made to look the other way for the right price, a lesson he would apply with masterful precision throughout his career. The end of Prohibition did not dry up the demand for vice, it simply redirected it. The Great Depression that followed left a population hungry for escape, and the numbers racket provided a cheap, accessible dream. Cleveland's unique demographic makeup, with its tightly knit ethnic enclaves and a large, economically marginalized African American population in areas like Central Scoville, created a perfect market for policy gambling. Birns's genius was in recognizing the potential for consolidation. He brought a monopolist's vision to a fragmented industry, using violence as his primary tool for mergers and acquisitions. But he could not have succeeded without the broader context of civic corruption. For decades, Cleveland had a reputation for a permeable boundary between City Hall and the underworld. Mayors and city councilmen were often beholden to political machines that were, in turn, funded by contributions from gambling and other vice operations. The police department was notoriously corrupt, with a system of payoffs that was as regular and predictable as a utility bill. Racketeers like Birns would pay a set weekly or monthly fee to the police, who would in return provide protection from raids and arrests. This symbiotic relationship created a stable, if morally bankrupt, ecosystem where crime could flourish with a degree of predictability. Burns's Theatrical Grill was the epicenter of this world, a neutral ground where the powerful from both sides of the law could mingle, make deals, and ensure the smooth functioning of the city's shadow economy. This system began to crack in the post-war era. A rising reform movement, a more aggressive press, and the increasing involvement of the federal government, armed with tools like the RISO Act, started to apply pressure. The old ways of doing business became riskier. The rise of Danny Greene was a symptom of this changing landscape. He was a new kind of criminal, less integrated into the old corrupt political machine, more of a freelance terrorist who relied on sheer audacity and media manipulation. The mafia's decision to use car bombs to eliminate both Greene and Birns was a sign of their desperation. It was a tactic born of a fear that the old methods of control, corruption, and intimidation were no longer sufficient. The bombs were a declaration that the unwritten rules had been suspended. The subsequent trial and convictions, fueled by federal witnesses like Ray Ferrito, exposed the rotten core of the city's power structure for all to see. It was a painful but necessary catharsis for Cleveland, a forced reckoning with its own complicity in the reign of men like Shondor Birns. His story, therefore, is not just the biography of a gangster. It is a reflection of the city itself during a tumultuous century. Its ambitions, its corruptions, its violent struggles, and its long, slow journey toward a difficult and hard won accountability. The violent demise of Shondor Birns did not simply erase his presence from the city he had dominated for so long. Instead, it cast a long and intricate shadow that touched every facet of Cleveland's underworld and its legitimate institutions, a legacy of fear, avarice, and institutional rot that would take years to dissipate. In the immediate power vacuum that followed the bombing, a frantic and bloody scramble ensued as various factions sought to claim their piece of his crumbled empire. The Cleveland Mafia, though severely wounded by the ongoing federal investigation, initially made the most significant grabs, moving to absorb the most profitable numbers routes in the central Scoville area, believing their elimination of Birns had cleared the path. However, their victory was Pyrrhic and short-lived. The convictions of James Liccavalli and his crew, a direct result of the Birns-Greene War, decapitated the family's leadership and sent a generation of its most capable soldiers to federal prison for life. This left the organization gutted, demoralized, and vulnerable. Unable to effectively control the territory they had fought so brutally to acquire, into this power void stepped a new, more diverse and decentralized criminal element. Younger, independent African American numbers bankers who had once been forced to pay tribute to Birns. now seized the opportunity to run their own operations free from his heavy taxation. Hispanic gangs, emerging in Cleveland's neighborhoods, began to exert their own influence. Most significantly, the landscape of illicit enterprise itself was shifting. The immense profits of the numbers racket, while still substantial, began to be rivaled and then surpassed by the burgeoning drug trade, particularly heroin in the 1970s and crack cocaine in the 1980s. This new trade was even more violent and less structured than the old world gambling operations, and it was run by a new breed of criminal who had no memory of or respect for the name Shondor Birns. His death, therefore, marked not just the end of a man, but the end of an entire era of organized crime in Cleveland. The era of the singular, larger-than-life kingpin who ruled a vast, vice-based empire through a combination of personal terror and systemic corruption. The city's political and law enforcement apparatus also underwent a forced and painful transformation in the aftermath. The brazen public bombings and the subsequent trial, which laid bare the deep connections between mobsters and city officials, created a firestorm of public outrage that could no longer be ignored. Reform-minded candidates ran for office on platforms of cleaning up the city within the police department. A new generation of officers and detectives, many of them embarrassed by the corruption of their predecessors, began to cooperate more fully with federal agencies like the FBI and the IRS. The old system of regular payoffs from gambling operations became far riskier and eventually collapsed under the weight of scrutiny and the threat of federal racketeering charges. The Theatrical Grill, that iconic symbol of the confluence of crime and power, closed its doors. Its physical demise a potent metaphor for the end of the world it represented. For the ordinary citizens of Cleveland, the legacy of Birns was a complex one. In the neighborhoods he had exploited, his death was for many a cause for quiet relief, the removal of a predatory force that had drained millions from the community. Yet, for others, particularly those who had benefited from his sporadic, self-serving generosity, he was remembered with a strange nostalgia, a character from a more defined, if more dangerous, time. He became a local myth, a name whispered in stories told in bars, a cautionary tale about the perils of ambition and the inevitability of a violent end. His story served as a grim reminder of the city's rough and tumble past, a time when industry and crime were the twin engines of the city, and a man with a hammer could build a kingdom in the shadows. The legacy of Shondor Birns is thus not found in a lasting criminal dynasty. His empire died with him, but in the indelible mark he left on the city's memory, a permanent scar that tells a story of how a city's hunger for order can sometimes create monsters, and how those monsters are, in the end, consumed by the very chaos they unleash. To reduce the life and times of Shondor Birns to a simple chronicle of criminal acts would be to miss the profound and unsettling historical echoes his story contains, a narrative that resonates with the foundational tensions of the American experience itself. He was, in his own brutal way, a perverse embodiment of the American dream, a figure who took the myth of the self, made man, and twisted it into a dark parable of unchecked ambition in a world without rules. The son of impoverished immigrants, he started with nothing but a capacity for violence and a burning desire to escape the destiny that poverty had assigned him. He seized upon the opportunities presented by prohibition and the numbers racket with the zeal of any Gilded Age industrialist. Seeing in the vices of the masses a resource to be extracted for immense profit, he consolidated a fractured industry, eliminated his competition through ruthless tactics that would make any corporate raider blush, and built a vertically integrated syndicate that operated with stunning efficiency. His flaunting of wealth, his tailored suits and luxury cars, his ownership of a glamorous nightclub, were all part of the performance of success, a desperate and ultimately hollow attempt to purchase the legitimacy that his birth had denied him. In this, his story mirrors that of other infamous American outlaws, from Al Capone to Meyer Lansky, men who used the tools of capitalism, supply, demand, market consolidation, and corruption of government to build empires outside the law, proving that the line between the robber baron and the gangster is often vanishingly thin. Yet, his life also serves as a grim case study in the limits of power built solely on fear. His entire worldview was predicated on the idea that terror was the ultimate and most durable form of control. He believed that by making himself the most feared man in Cleveland, he had constructed an impregnable fortress. But fear, as a governing principle, has a fatal flaw. It inevitably breeds resentment, jealousy, and ultimately, a desire for retribution. It creates a world where loyalty is transactional and temporary, where allies are merely those who have not yet found an advantage in betrayal. The conspiracy that killed him was the ultimate expression of this flaw. The mafia, his temporary allies, feared his independence and coveted his wealth. His own lieutenant, Keith Ritson, likely saw greater opportunity in a world without his master. The bomb that tore him apart was not just a weapon. It was the physical manifestation of the fear and greed he had sown throughout his life, now circling back to consume him. His story is a classical tragedy in the oldest sense, where the hero's greatest strength, his ruthless will to power, becomes the instrument of his downfall. He was a man who understood the mechanics of fear, but was blind to the nuances of trust, who could control a city, but could not see the betrayal growing in his own inner circle. Furthermore, his reign highlights the corrosive societal cost of systemic corruption. Cleveland in the Birns era was not a city where crime flourished in spite of the government. It flourished because key elements of the government were complicit. The regular payoffs to police, the cozy relationships with judges and politicians at the Theatrical Grill, created a permissive environment where his empire could thrive for decades. This symbiosis between the criminal and the legitimate is a recurring theme in American history, a reminder that the underworld cannot exist on a large scale without the tacit or active cooperation of the overworld. The eventual collapse of this system, triggered by the sheer brazenness of the Birns and Greene bombings, demonstrates that there is a limit to public tolerance, a point at which the stench of corruption becomes too overwhelming to ignore. The story of Shondor Birns, therefore, is more than a true crime tale. It is a multifaceted historical artifact. It is a story about immigration and assimilation gone awry, about the dark side of the American entrepreneurial spirit, about the inherent instability of power based on terror, and about the fragile nature of the social contract in a city where the lines between law and lawlessness have been deliberately erased. He is a figure who forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of power, the price of ambition, and the societal conditions that allow a boy from the tenements to become a king in the shadows, only to be destroyed by the very forces that made him. The human cost of Shondor Birns' empire, a tally often lost in the grand narratives of power and betrayal, is a vast and silent ledger of ruined lives, broken families, and a community systematically drained of its economic vitality. To view his reign solely through the lens of his own brutal end is to ignore the countless smaller, quieter tragedies that were the daily product of his enterprise. The numbers racket, the foundation of his wealth, was a brilliantly engineered machine of exploitation, preying with mathematical precision on the most vulnerable citizens of Cleveland. It offered a seductive, lottery-like dream to factory workers, domestic laborers, and the unemployed, a glimmer of hope in a world of limited opportunity. For the price of a few cents, a person could dream of paying off rent, buying a new stove, or getting a family member much needed medical care. But the dream was a carefully calculated illusion. The odds were so astronomically stacked against the player that the occasional, highly publicized payout was merely the cost of doing business, a marketing expense that perpetuated the cycle of hope and loss. The true, relentless reality was the slow, steady siphon of millions of dollars from the pockets of the poor into the coffers of Birns and his organization. This was not a victimless crime. It was a relentless transfer of wealth from those who could least afford it to a man who flaunted his opulence in their faces. Beyond the financial drain, the racket created a culture of dependency and despair. Men and women would pawn family heirlooms, skip meals, or neglect essential bills to place their daily bet, chasing the elusive number that would solve all their problems. The psychological toll was immense, creating a cycle of addiction as potent as any drug. The violence that underpinned Birns' control also cast a long shadow. Store owners who refused to host numbers slips faced vandalism and arson. Rival operators who dared to challenge his monopoly were met with savage beatings, their broken bodies serving as a warning to others. The families of these men lived in constant fear, never knowing if their husband or father would return home from work. The corruption Birns engineered within the police department and city government had another, more insidious victim, the concept of justice itself. When the very institutions tasked with protecting citizens are on the payroll of a criminal syndicate, the social contract is shattered. People in neighborhoods like Central, Scoville learned that they could not rely on the police for protection, that the law was not blind but for sale. This erosion of trust in civic institutions created a deep and lasting cynicism, a belief that the system was rigged against them, a legacy of disenfranchisement that would outlive Burns by generations. Even those who worked for him were not immune to the cost. The runners and collectors, often young men from the same impoverished neighborhoods, lived precarious lives. They'd have faced the constant risk of arrest, though the charges were often dismissed due to bribes, and the ever-present threat of robbery from rival crews or even their own associates. They were the disposable foot soldiers in a war for wealth they would never share. Their small wages a pittance compared to the river of cash that flowed to Burns. And then there were the direct, personal tragedies, the children who grew up in the shadow of his violence, witnessing beatings or hearing the whispered fears of their parents. The wives and girlfriends, like Juanita, who on that March evening in 1975 became an unwitting witness to an act of horrific violence that would haunt her for the rest of her days. The story of Shondor Birns is, at its core, a story of human collateral damage. For every tailored suit he bought, for every Cadillac he drove, for every lavish tip he bestowed at the Theatrical Grill, there was a corresponding story of a family going without, a dream deferred, a life lived in fear, or a belief in justice extinguished. His legacy is not just the memory of a feared gangster, but the immeasurable and often invisible suffering that was the true price of his power, a debt paid in the quiet desperation of a city he called his own. The figure of Danny Greene, the flamboyant and fearless Irishman, stands as the perfect antithesis and final antagonist in the story of Shondor Birns, a force of chaotic energy whose rise directly challenged the established order that Birns represented and whose eventual destruction became fatally intertwined with his own. To understand the end of Birns, one must understand the phenomenon of Greene. Where Birns was old world, calculating, and built his power in the shadows through systematic corruption, Greene was new school, flamboyant, and waged his wars as much in the media as in the streets. He cultivated a public persona with bravado, presenting himself as a Celtic warrior battling the established Italian and Jewish mobs. A narrative that resonated with a certain segment of the population and infuriated his enemies. He drove a green car, wore green clothing, and famously left a shamrock at the scenes of his crimes, or, in one infamous instance, on the body of a rival he had slain, a signature that was both a taunt and a brand. This audacity was his armor. He understood that in the modern world, notoriety could be a form of power, making him a harder target and transforming him from a simple gangster into a folk legend. His survival through multiple assassination attempts, including car bombs that failed to detonate properly, only added to his mythos, creating an aura of invincibility that seemed to defy the old rules of the underworld, where a bullet from a .38 usually settled disputes. For Shondor Birns, Greene was an existential threat, not because he was more powerful, but because he was unpredictable and refused to acknowledge the hierarchy that Birns had spent a lifetime building. Greene's incursions into the numbers racket, a territory Birns considered his sovereign domain, were not just business challenges, they were profound insults. The old guard's method of controlled, corrupt coexistence was impossible with a man like Greene, who operated like a guerrilla, striking unpredictably and leveraging his public image as a shield. The alliance between Birns and the Cleveland Mafia to eliminate Greene was therefore a marriage of sheer desperation, an attempt by two traditional powers to crush a disruptive new force that threatened the ecosystem they both relied upon. But this alliance, forged in the fires of mutual hatred, was built on a foundation of sand. The Mafia, particularly James Licavoli's faction, viewed both men as problems. Greene was the immediate public nuisance, but Birns was the long-term liability, an independent operator with too much knowledge and too much wealth. The decision to eliminate both was a cold, corporate calculation. The bomb that killed Birns was not an isolated event. It was the first half of a 1-2 punch designed to reset the board. The funding, partially sourced from Birns himself through the treachery of Keith Ritson, added a layer of cruel irony that perfectly captured the duplicitous nature of the world he inhabited. He was, in effect, bankrolling his own murder to solve a problem that, in the eyes of his killers, he himself had become. The subsequent bombing that killed Danny Greene, while achieving its immediate goal, also triggered the chain of events that would bring the conspirators to justice. The sheer brazenness of 2 public bombings in less than a year created a level of law enforcement pressure the old underworld was unprepared to handle. The code of silence, the omerta that had protected them for decades, cracked under the weight of federal investigations and the self-preservation instincts of men like Ray Ferrito. In the end, the conflict between Birns and Greene was a mutually assured destruction. The old king and the young pretender destroyed each other, and in their fiery demise, they brought down the very structure they had fought to control. The story of their war is a timeless parable about the nature of power and the inevitability of change, demonstrating that no empire, whether built on fear or charisma, can withstand the tectonic shifts of a new era and the corrosive power of betrayal from within. The physical landscape of Cleveland itself served as a silent character in the drama of Shondor Birns' life, its neighborhoods, streets, and landmarks providing the stage upon which his rise and fall were enacted, each location imbued with a significance that ranged from aspiration to terror. His story begins in the cramped tenements of the Woodland Avenue neighborhood, a bustling, noisy, and fiercely competitive world of immigrant dreams. These streets were his first classroom, where he learned the brutal curriculum of survival, where his fists earned him the nickname that would define him, and where he first understood that authority was not given but taken. This environment of struggle and scarcity shaped his entire worldview, instilling in him a relentless drive to escape and a permanent belief that the world was a fundamentally hostile place. As he ascended from petty crime to bootlegging, the geography of his operations expanded to include the wharves and warehouses along the Cuyahoga River, where illicit alcohol was smuggled in under the cover of industry and fog, and the network of speakeasies hidden in plain sight across the city. But the true seat of his power, the symbol of his arrival, was the Theatrical Grill on Short Vincent Avenue. This was not merely a nightclub. It was the physical manifestation of his success and his corruption. In its smoky, dimly lit interior, the dualities of Cleveland converged. Judges, politicians, and police officials sat at tables next to bookmakers, enforcers, and hitmen. The back office was where the real business was conducted. The counting of the day's numbers take, the distribution of payoffs to corrupt officials, the planning of strategies against rivals. For Birns, the grill was his castle, a place where he could perform the role of a legitimate businessman and power broker, a world away from the poverty of Woodland Avenue. It was here that he felt most in control, most insulated from the consequences of his actions. Yet, the city also contained the spaces of his vulnerability and his ultimate defeat. The Euclid Avenue area, where his girlfriend lived, represented a part of his life that was separate from the brutal commerce of the grill, a private sanctuary. It was in this seemingly safe, residential space that his predictability became his undoing. The killers knew his routine. They knew he would visit that apartment, and they knew the exact make and model of the car he would be driving. The Lincoln Continental, parked on a public street, was transformed from a symbol of his opulence into a death trap. The bomb that was planted beneath it turned a quiet Cleveland street into a ground zero of underworld violence, a shocking intrusion of terror into the everyday world. The subsequent bombing that killed Danny Greene in a Lyndhurst parking lot further expanded the geography of this war, proving that not even the suburbs were safe from the carnage. These locations, the impoverished immigrant neighborhood, the glamorous nightclub, the residential street, the suburban parking lot, mapped the trajectory of his life, from desperate origins to the pinnacle of power, and finally to a violent, public end. After his death, these places began to change, their meanings eroding with time. The Woodland Avenue neighborhood underwent urban renewal and demographic shifts. The Theatrical Grill, that iconic symbol of a bygone era, eventually closed, its memory fading. The exact spot where his car was bombed holds no plaque, no marker. The city moved on. The physical scars of that night long since paved over. This erasure is itself a part of his story. The Cleveland of Shondor Birns, a city of smoky industry, entrenched corruption, and larger-than-life gangsters, gradually transformed into a different city, one forced to confront its past and slowly, painfully, rebuild its institutions. The landscape that once nurtured him now barely remembers him, his legacy preserved not in brick and mortar, but in the stories, the court transcripts, and the enduring cautionary tale of a man who ruled a city from the shadows, only to be destroyed by the very darkness he embraced. The machinery of justice, though slow and often compromised, eventually caught up with the world of Shondor Birns, but its form and function evolved dramatically from the era of his rise to the time of his fall, reflecting a national shift in the war on organized crime. In his early years, the justice system was not an adversary to be defeated, but an institution to be managed, another utility to be paid for like any other. Local police and prosecutors were, in many cases, actively on his payroll, ensuring that arrests were rare, indictments were weak, and convictions were nearly impossible. The system was a permeable membrane through which a man with enough cash and the right connections could pass with little more than a minor inconvenience. His occasional arrests and short stints in local jails were merely the cost of doing business, a temporary interruption rather than a genuine threat. This changed with the involvement of the federal government. His 1955 conviction for tax evasion was a watershed moment. The first time a weapon from the federal arsenal was used against him with decisive effect. The IRS and the Justice Department operated outside the sphere of his local corruption. They could not be bribed with the same ease as a Cleveland police lieutenant. They attacked him not for his violence, which was difficult to prove in court, but for the fruits of that violence, his lavish, unreported income. This conviction and his subsequent prison sentence were a stark warning that his immunity was not absolute, that there was a higher power whose reach extended beyond his network of corrupt officials. The final and most profound evolution of justice in his story came after his death, with the successful application of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The RACO Act, passed in 1970, was a legal revolution designed specifically to combat the kind of criminal enterprise Birns had perfected. It allowed prosecutors to target the entire organization as a continuing criminal enterprise, tying together acts like murder, extortion, and gambling into a single pattern of racketeering. The investigation into the Birns and Greene bombings became one of the early, landmark uses of this powerful tool. It enabled the FBI to build a case, not just against the trigger pullers like Ray Ferrito, but against the bosses who gave the orders, like James Licavoli. The conspiracy charges under RAICO painted the entire Cleveland Mafia as a criminal organization, and the testimony of turncoats like Ferrito and Keith Ritson provided the intricate details needed to secure convictions. The trial that followed was not about a single murder. It was about the structure and operation of the syndicate itself. The life sentences handed down to Licavoli and his associates represented a final, decisive victory for this new form of justice. It was a posthumous form of accountability for Birns, as the same legal machinery that dismantled the organization that killed him also laid bare the full scope of the criminal world he had helped to build. The witnesses who broke the code of silence, men like Ferrito entering the witness protection program, represented another new reality: the government's ability to offer deals and protection that could outweigh the underworld's power to punish betrayal. In the end, the story of justice in the life and times of Shondor Birns is a story of a system learning, adapting, and ultimately overcoming the very corruption that had once rendered it impotent. It moved from being a local, corruptible force to a federal, relentless one. From prosecuting discrete crimes to dismantling entire criminal enterprises, from relying on physical evidence to leveraging the testimony of insiders. The hammer of justice, once a tool he could bend to his will, was finally reforged into an instrument powerful enough to shatter the empire he had built and punish the men who had destroyed him. The enduring fascination with Shondor Birns, a man who has been dead for nearly half a century, speaks to something deep within the American psyche, a complex attraction to the figure of the outlaw who carves his own destiny from the raw, unforgiving material of society. He has been transformed from a man of flesh, blood, and terrible violence into a myth, a symbol, a character in the ongoing story Cleveland tells about itself. In the years since his death, his story has been told and retold in true crime books, documentary films, and articles, each iteration sanding down the rougher, more horrifying edges of his reality and adding a layer of legend. The man known as the Hammer becomes less a specific historical figure and more an archetype, the self-made gangster, the king of the underworld, the victim of a shocking betrayal. This process of myth-making often emphasizes his cunning and his flamboyance over the sheer brutality of his methods. The Clawhammer story is recounted with a kind of grim admiration for its effectiveness. The massive tips at the Theatrical Grill are remembered as marks of a quirky generosity, and his ability to corrupt an entire city is sometimes framed as a testament to his power, rather than an indictment of civic failure. He becomes a folk anti-hero, particularly in a city like Cleveland, which has often defined itself by its grit and its ability to withstand hard knocks. In this narrative, Birns is a product of his environment, a man who took the hard lessons of a hard city and used them to become its unofficial shadow ruler. His story resonates because it touches on universal themes: the desire to overcome humble beginnings, the hunger for power and respect, and the tragic flaw that leads to a downfall. He is a classical tragic figure in a modern setting, and his end, blown apart by a car bomb, has the dramatic, conclusive finality of a Shakespearean play. Furthermore, his story serves as a dark mirror to the legitimate American success story. He achieved the wealth and status that the culture venerates, but he did so through means that society condemns. This contradiction forces an uncomfortable examination of the values that underpin the American dream itself, questioning where the line falls between ambitious entrepreneurship and ruthless criminality. The world he inhabited, of smoky nightclubs, political corruption, and gangland wars, has a certain gritty romanticism when viewed from the safe distance of history, stripped of its real-life consequences. We are fascinated by the danger, the power, the larger-than-life characters, and the moral ambiguities. The name Shondor Birns now evokes an era, a specific time and place in American history when cities like Cleveland were ruled as much by men in the shadows as by men in City Hall. His legacy is not a criminal empire which died with him, but a story, a cautionary tale, a piece of local folklore, and a permanent part of the city's identity, a reminder of a time when a man with a hammer could build a kingdom, and a bomb could bring it all down in a fireball of betrayal and retribution. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, a long and winding path through the life and times of Shondor Birns. From the impoverished tenements of Woodland Avenue to the opulent heights of the Theatrical Grill, and finally, to the fiery, brutal conclusion on a quiet Euclid Avenue street. His story is not a simple one. It is a complex tapestry woven with threads of ambition, violence, power, and profound human tragedy. We have seen how a hungry, fatherless boy from an immigrant family internalized the brutal lessons of his environment and forged them into a weapon, becoming the Hammer, a man whose name alone could instill paralyzing fear. We have followed his ruthless ascent, his consolidation of the numbers racket, a cruel enterprise that preyed on the hopes of the poor while generating immense, untaxed wealth that he flaunted as a symbol of his arrival. We have observed the intricate web of corruption he spun, ensnaring police, politicians, and judges in a symbiotic relationship that allowed his empire to thrive for decades in the very heart of the city. We have witnessed his inability to adapt to a changing world, his fatal miscalculation in allying with the Cleveland Mafia against the chaotic force of Danny Greene, and the ultimate betrayal that led him to unknowingly finance his own horrific death. We have seen the aftermath, the justice that, though delayed, eventually dismantled the conspiracy that killed him and crippled the organized crime structure of an entire city. And we have reflected on the immense human cost, the silent ledger of lives ruined by his rackets and his violence, and the enduring legacy of a man transformed from a criminal into a myth, a dark symbol of Cleveland's gritty past. His life serves as a powerful, multifaceted cautionary tale. It is a warning about the corrupting nature of absolute power, demonstrating how a man can become so insulated by his own might that he fails to see the betrayal growing at his right hand. It is a lesson in the inherent instability of a kingdom built solely on fear, a foundation that will always be vulnerable to the shifting sands of envy and self-interest. It is a stark reminder of the societal cost of systemic corruption, showing how the rot of paid-off officials and compromised institutions allows criminal enterprises to flourish, poisoning the very concept of justice for an entire community. And on a more profound, human level, the story of Shondor Birns is a tragic exploration of the American dream distorted, a tale of how the desperate desire to escape poverty and achieve significance can be twisted into a monstrous pursuit of power at any cost, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. He was a man who had everything he thought he wanted: wealth, power, respect born of terror, and yet died alone in a cataclysm of fire and metal, betrayed by those he trusted, his empire dissolving before his body was even identified. His story is now complete, a chapter closed in the history of American crime. But the echoes of his life, the lessons embedded in his rise and fall, remain. They remind us of the fragility of power, the price of corruption, and the enduring human fascination with the dark allure of the outlaw. The tale of Shondor Birns, the Cleveland mobster, is now yours to carry forward, a story to remember, to reflect upon, and to share.